Hello and welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's topic because honestly, we're going to completely reframe a narrative you probably think you already know inside out. When we think of American slavery, our minds usually jump straight to a localized Southern institution centered around cotton. But today, we're pulling way back. We're going to explore how a massive, interconnected global economic engine, fueled literally by a simple human craving for sweetness, resulted in unimaginable human suffering and basically built the foundations of the modern global economy. To truly wrap our heads around this complex topic, we're going to follow this roadmap. First, the sweet catalyst. Second, the brutal sugar engine. Third, the Middle Passage. Fourth, the triangular trade web. And finally, number 5, fueling the machine. Let's dive right in.
Okay, let's start by looking at the actual destinations of enslaved Africans in the New World, because this data absolutely shatters common preconceptions. Brazil, they took in 40%. The British and French West Indies combined took in another 36%. Spanish America brought in 15%, and North America, just 5%. Only 5% of enslaved Africans were brought to the mainland. Seeing it laid out like this completely justifies our focus today on the West Indies and South America, right? Because that is where the vast, overwhelming majority of this enslaved labor was actually directed.
Section 1. The sweet catalyst, the crop that changed the world.
So, to understand this whole system, we've got to introduce the single crop most responsible for the transatlantic slave trade. And spoiler alert, it wasn't cotton and it wasn't tobacco. It was white gold, sugar. The journey of sugar is actually pretty wild. It started way back in ancient Papua New Guinea, making its way to India, where people marveled at it as a reed bringing forth honey without bees. Over centuries, it spread like wildfire through the Islamic world, up into Mediterranean regions like Sicily and Cyprus, and finally, by the 15th century, it moved out into the Atlantic islands, which is exactly where the Portuguese started setting up the very first true plantation-style systems.
Now here's something absolutely crucial to understand. The link between sugar and slavery, it existed long before the African transatlantic trade even began. Early on, those Mediterranean sugar plantations were actually worked by enslaved Eastern European people from the Black Sea region. In fact, the very word slave comes directly from sklavus, which is the Latin word for people of Slavic descent. So this historical precedent, the idea that cultivating sugar was so incredibly labor-intensive that it required bonded human labor, well, that was firmly established way before the Portuguese and Spanish ever crossed the Atlantic.
Moving on to Section 2, the brutal sugar engine, Barbados and the shift to perpetual bondage.
We're shifting our focus across the ocean now, right into the Caribbean, to look at how the English established their most valuable 17th century colony. Out on the eastern edge of the West Indies sits Barbados. When English colonists first set foot here, they actually tried to grow tobacco, but, well, it flopped. The market completely crashed in the late 1630s when much better tobacco flooded in from elsewhere. So, between 1640 and 1660, with a little help from the Dutch, these planters pivoted entirely to sugar production, and the result? Absolute jackpot. They struck immense, unimaginable wealth and became the most envied planters in the whole world. But, of course, all that wealth required an enormous amount of labor.
Initially, the English relied on indentured servants. We're talking mostly poor, desperate, or sometimes even kidnapped people from Britain and Ireland. But we really need to clearly contrast these two labor systems. Indentured servitude was often brutally exploitative. Backbreaking work, for sure. But it was temporary. If you managed to survive your contract, you eventually earned your freedom. Slavery in the New World, on the other hand, was fundamentally different. It was racially constituted, it was perpetual, and it was hereditary. Enslaved Africans were completely stripped of all human rights, and tragically, would never go free.
And what we're looking at here brilliantly illustrates what that perpetual bondage actually looked like. The reality played out among grueling, heavy machinery and the absolutely suffocating heat of the boiling pans. Father Antonio Vieira, when he was observing a similar Brazilian sugar mill, described it as seeing people working briskly and moaning without a single moment of peace. He literally called the noisy machinery the image of hell. It was a labor regime of backbreaking ferocity that was just completely unprecedented in its harshness.
7 years. Just let that number sink in for a second. That was the average survival rate for an enslaved African on a West Indian sugar plantation. The deeply unsettling truth here is that for Brazilian and West Indian planters, the brutally calculated math dictated a horrifying reality. It was simply cheaper to work human beings to death and just buy replacements than it was to provide them with the basic necessities to live and rear children. The profits from sugar were so massively inflated that a planter could recoup the entire cost of an enslaved person in just 18 months. It's just devastating.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Middle Passage, the supply chain of human cargo. To feed this insatiable agricultural machine, an entirely new transoceanic supply chain had to be built. But we absolutely cannot discuss the macroeconomic scale of this trade without grounding it in the terrifying human reality. Listen to this harrowing eyewitness account from Alexander Falconbridge, who was a doctor on a slave ship. He wrote that the floor was covered with blood and mucus, resembling a slaughterhouse. Below decks, the unbearable heat, the chains, and the rapid spread of amoebic dysentery, which they called the bloody flux, created conditions that are honestly almost inconceivable to us today. It's a very sobering reminder that this entire industry was built on a foundation of absolute human despair.
This system utilized a horrific practice known as tight packing. Ship captains crammed as many human beings as mathematically possible into the hull, strictly to maximize profit. This cold, mechanical diagram captures exactly those slaughterhouse conditions Falconbridge described, revealing the truly terrifying industrial scale of this transport.
The sheer numbers are just staggering. Between 1501 and 1866, an estimated 12.5 million human beings were loaded onto these ships in Africa. And because of those horrific conditions we just talked about, nearly 2 million of those people died at sea, never even reaching the New World.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this all builds, the triangular trade web, the macroeconomic view of global commerce.
We're going to pull back now and look at the big picture, revealing how these local, isolated horrors actually funded the dawn of the modern world. This interconnected global trade web meant that every single region depended entirely on the others. This circuit didn't just move goods around. It created a vast, unprecedented accumulation of capital, specifically in England. The profits obtained from this tightly woven system provided one of the major streams of wealth that directly financed the Industrial Revolution.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of this triangular trade step by step, so you can see exactly how it worked. Step 1. A typical British trading ship would carry manufactured goods, things like textiles, guns, and iron pots, from Europe down to Africa, where they were traded for human beings. Step 2 is the Middle Passage, bringing those enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the West Indies to work the sugar plantations. And finally, Step 3 saw the fruits of that grueling labor, slave-grown sugar and molasses shipped back to Europe and North America. It's like a giant, tragic puzzle coming together.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Fueling the Machine, the surprising role of the North American colonies.
Now, we established earlier that the British North American colonies imported only 5% of the total enslaved Africans. So you might be thinking, well, that makes them a pretty minor player, right? Actually, no. In reality, they were the fuel keeping this entire sugar engine running. See, the West Indian planters were so utterly hyper-focused on maximizing their sugar profits that they used nearly every square inch of their land for sugarcane. Instead of growing their own food, they relied completely on the North American mainland, especially New England and the Middle Colonies, just to survive. North America shipped them thousands of tons of beef, pork, and grain, the lumber for their shipping casks, horses to power their mills, and a staggering 63% of all dried fish produced in New England, which was primarily used to feed the enslaved populations.
In return for all those vital provisions, New Englanders brought back molasses, which is this syrupy byproduct of sugar refining. And what did they do with it? Well, they distilled it into what they called Kill Devil, a hot, hellish liquor that we know today as rum. New Englanders imported massive amounts of West Indian molasses to build what quickly became their region's absolute largest manufacturing business before the Revolution, the rum distillery.
So the crucial point here is this. When you tally up the food grown to feed enslaved laborers in the Caribbean, the wood shipped to build their barrels, and the rum distilled from their molasses, an astounding 75% of all New England exports by 1770 were tied in some way to the transatlantic slave trade. The northern colonies weren't just bystanders. They were deeply, fundamentally invested in this system.
Meanwhile, down on the mainland, the southern colonies also transitioned away from indentured servitude, moving toward a brutal, slave-based agricultural system of their own. For cash crops like tobacco in the Chesapeake and later rice in South Carolina, the mainland American colonies firmly entrenched the legal and social frameworks of perpetual human bondage.
When we pull it all together, we are left with this stark, deeply unsettling juxtaposition.
Think about this. Every single spoonful of sugar consumed in Great Britain, sweetening their afternoon tea, their coffee, their chocolate, was slave-grown. The math was devastatingly simple and horrifying. One enslaved human being died for every 2 tons of sugar produced. The everyday luxury of a cup of sweet tea in London or a glass of rum in Boston was quite literally paid for with a horrific human cost on the plantations of the Caribbean and South America.
So, we want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. The dawn of modern global consumerism, the very accumulation of capital that sparked the Industrial Revolution, was funded by enslaved human labor. When you realize that every colony, every trade route, and every single spoonful of sugar was part of this vast, interconnected web, how does that change the way you view the foundations of our modern global economy? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history behind the world we live in today.